Have you ever been judged so harshly by someone that their words carved themselves into your soul like a blade you never saw coming? Have you ever stood there, vulnerable and hopeful, only to watch someone destroy your confidence with a single glance and a cruel laugh? Well, let me tell you about the day that changed everything for me. The day a hiring manager looked at my face and decided I wasn't worthy of basic human decency, let alone a job. But this isn't just a story about being mocked or humiliated. This is about what happened after. About the fire that was lit inside me that day. A fire that would eventually burn so bright that the man who tried to extinguish my spirit would one day stand in its warmth, begging for mercy. I'm not here to tell you a fairy tale where everything magically works out. I'm here to share the raw, unfiltered truth about what it feels like to be reduced to nothing more than your appearance, and how I clawed my way back from that darkness to make sure he would never forget my face, not because of how I looked, but because of what I became. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing that I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, and I had a birthmark that covered nearly half of my face, a port wine stain that had been with me since the day I was born. Growing up, I'd heard every comment imaginable. Kids can be cruel, but I learned to develop thick skin, or so I thought. I convinced myself that adults would be different, that in the professional world, my skills and knowledge would speak louder than my appearance. I was so naive, so desperately hopeful, that the world would be fair if I just worked hard enough. That Tuesday morning in September, I woke up with butterflies dancing in my stomach, the good kind that comes with excitement and possibility. I had an interview at Morrison & Klein, one of the most prestigious marketing firms in the city, and I'd prepared for weeks. I knew their campaigns inside and out. I'd memorized statistics about their client retention rates, and I'd even designed a mock campaign for one of their biggest clients as part of my portfolio. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that morning, wearing my best navy suit, the one I'd saved up for months to buy, and I practiced my smile, the way I'd shake hands, the confidence I wanted to project. My roommate Sarah told me I looked professional and capable, and I almost believed her. The office building was downtown, all glass and steel reaching toward the clouds like a monument to success. And as I walked through those revolving doors, I felt like I was stepping into my future. The lobby was immaculate, with marble floors that echoed with every step and modern art pieces that probably cost more than my entire education. I checked in at the reception desk, where a kind woman with silver hair told me to take the elevator to the 14th floor, and I remember feeling my heart race with each floor that passed. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a sleek office space with an open floor plan, young professionals typing away at standing desks, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. A woman named Jennifer, who I assumed was from HR, greeted me with a warm handshake and led me to a conference room. She seemed genuinely interested in my background, asking thoughtful questions about my thesis on digital consumer behavior, and for about 15 minutes I felt seen, valued, appreciated for my mind rather than my appearance. Then he walked in. Daniel Morrison, son of the company founder and the regional hiring manager, strode into that conference room like he owned not just the building, but the very air we were breathing. He was probably in his late 30s, wearing an expensive charcoal suit with a tie that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he had that particular kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself because your last name already did it for you. Jennifer stood up immediately, and I noticed the shift in her demeanor, the way her warmth turned slightly cooler, more formal. I stood as well, extending my hand for a professional handshake, my practiced smile firmly in place, my portfolio clutched in my other hand like a shield. But Daniel Morrison didn't take my hand. Instead, his eyes landed on my face, specifically on my birthmark, and I watched his expression change in real time. First came surprise, then something that looked almost like disgust, and finally, to my absolute horror, amusement. He actually smiled. Not a polite professional smile, but a smirk that made my blood run cold. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I stood there, hand still extended, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than I'd ever felt in my life. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot, and I could see her trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Then, Daniel Morrison laughed. Not a subtle chuckle or a nervous laugh, but a full, dismissive laugh that echoed off the conference room walls. He turned to Jennifer and said, in a voice dripping with condescension, "Is this some kind of joke? Did someone from the office put you up to this?" My hand slowly dropped to my side as I tried to process what was happening. Jennifer's face turned red, and she stammered something about my impressive credentials and academic achievements. But Morrison cut her off with a wave of his hand. He looked directly at me, and I'll never forget the cruelty in his eyes when he said, "Look, sweetheart, I don't know what kind of diversity initiative this is supposed to fulfill, but we're a client-facing firm. Our people represent our brand, and our brand is about excellence, beauty, and perfection. We can't have someone who looks like they got into a fight with a paintbrush representing Morrison and Klein to our clients." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last. I felt my carefully constructed confidence crumbling. Felt the walls I'd built around my insecurities collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. But what hurt even more than his words was watching Jennifer's reaction. She didn't defend me, didn't stand up for the qualifications she'd just been praising. Instead, she looked down at her notes, avoiding eye contact, complicit in her silence. I wanted to scream, to throw my portfolio in his smug face, to tell him exactly what kind of human being he was, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. Morrison continued, apparently enjoying my visible distress. "I mean, have you looked in a mirror recently? Do you honestly think clients want to sit across from that?" He gestured vaguely at my face. "During important meetings? Come on, be realistic. Maybe try applying for back-end positions, somewhere you don't have to interact with people. Or better yet, consider a different career path altogether." Something inside me broke in that moment. Something fundamental and important. It wasn't just my pride or my confidence. It was my naive belief that the world would judge me fairly, that my hard work and abilities would matter more than the accident of my birth. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me completely destroyed. Instead, I gathered what little dignity I had left, picked up my portfolio with shaking hands, and said in a voice that somehow remained steady, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Morrison. I hope you remember this conversation." He laughed again, that same dismissive laugh, and replied, "Sweetheart, I guarantee you I'll forget about you before I even leave this room. You're just another unqualified applicant who overestimated their worth." I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, even though inside I was shattering into a million pieces. I made it through the lobby, through the revolving doors, down 2 blocks to a small park, where I finally sat on a bench and let the tears fall. I cried for the girl who'd believed the world would be fair, for all the hours I'd spent preparing for an interview that was doomed the moment he saw my face, for every cruel comment and judgment I'd endured throughout my life. But somewhere between the tears and the pain, something else was growing, something hot and fierce and unstoppable. It was rage, yes, but it was more than that. It was determination. It was a promise to myself that Daniel Morrison would remember my face, not because of my birthmark, but because I would become impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to forget. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment, still wearing my interview suit, staring at my reflection in the mirror with new eyes. For years, I'd tried to minimize my birthmark, using makeup techniques and strategic hairstyles, always trying to make myself more palatable to a world that seemed determined to judge me. But sitting there, mascara streaked down my cheeks, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized that I'd been living my life trying to apologize for my appearance, trying to make others comfortable with something that was simply a part of me. No more. I picked up my phone and started researching, diving deep into stories of people who'd overcome discrimination and prejudice. Entrepreneurs who'd built empires from nothing. Individuals who'd turned their perceived weaknesses into their greatest strengths. I read until my eyes burned, and the sun started peeking through my curtains, absorbing every lesson, every strategy, every inspiration I could find. My roommate Sarah found me the next morning still sitting at my desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups and pages of notes. She'd heard me crying the night before and knew something had happened at the interview. But she didn't ask questions. She just sat down beside me and listened as I poured out the entire humiliating experience. When I finished, I expected pity or sympathy, but Sarah surprised me. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to let that pompous jerk define your worth? Or are you going to prove him wrong?" That question became my North Star for everything that followed. I spent the next 3 days applying to every marketing position I could find, but with a new strategy. Instead of just sending in applications and hoping for the best, I researched each company thoroughly, identified their biggest challenges, and created customized campaign proposals that I included with my applications. It was exhausting work, often taking me 4 or 5 hours per application, but I was driven by something more powerful than fatigue. I was driven by the memory of Daniel Morrison's laugh and my promise that he would remember my face. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a small startup called Technova, a company developing educational software for underprivileged schools. They were struggling to gain market traction despite having an incredible product. And the founder, a woman named Patricia Chen, was impressed with the guerrilla marketing strategy I'd proposed in my application. The interview was conducted over video call, and I noticed Patricia's brief glance at my birthmark. But unlike Morrison, she quickly refocused on my ideas, my passion, my vision for their brand. She offered me the position on the spot, though she was honest about the limitations. The salary was modest, barely enough to cover my rent and basic expenses, and there was no guarantee the company would even survive its first year. But she offered me something more valuable than money. She offered me creative freedom, trust, and the opportunity to prove myself. I accepted immediately. Working at Technova was like drinking from a fire hose. The team was small, just 7 of us working out of a cramped office that used to be a storage unit. But the energy was incredible. Patricia believed in our mission with every fiber of her being, and that belief was contagious. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me, often staying late into the night developing campaigns, analyzing data, adjusting strategies. My birthmark became irrelevant in that environment. My colleagues saw me for my ideas, my work ethic, my results. When our first major campaign launched, targeting educational conferences and teacher forums with heartfelt stories about students whose lives had been changed by accessible technology, I barely slept for 72 hours, monitoring every metric, adjusting ad spend in real time, engaging with every comment and question. The campaign went viral in our niche market, generating more leads in 1 week than the company had gotten in the previous 6 months. Patricia cried when she saw the numbers, actually cried tears of joy and relief, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. The pure satisfaction of knowing my work, my mind, my creativity had created something meaningful. Have you ever felt that moment when you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do? That was my experience at Technova, and it fueled me to push even harder. Over the next 18 months, I lived and breathed marketing strategy. I consumed every book, every podcast, every case study I could find. I networked relentlessly, attending industry events where I was often the youngest person in the room and certainly the one with the most visible facial difference. But I learned to use that to my advantage. People remembered me, and I made sure they remembered me for the right reasons, for my insights, for my innovative ideas, for my ability to see marketing challenges from angles others missed. Technova grew exponentially during this time. We secured funding from a major venture capital firm, expanded our team to 30 people, and moved into a real office space with actual conference rooms and a kitchen that didn't smell like mold. My title changed from marketing coordinator to director of marketing, and with each promotion came new responsibilities and new opportunities to prove myself. But success at Technova was just the foundation of what I was building. In my limited spare time, I started a blog about authentic brand building and inclusive marketing practices. I wrote about how companies were missing enormous market opportunities by maintaining narrow definitions of beauty and professionalism, how diversity wasn't just ethically right but financially smart, how the most powerful brands were those that made all people feel seen and valued. My posts started getting traction, shared by industry leaders and featured in marketing newsletters. I was invited to speak at a small conference about digital marketing trends, and despite my terror at public speaking, I accepted. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of about 200 marketing professionals, I made a decision. I didn't hide my birthmark or apologize for it. Instead, I opened my talk by addressing it directly. You've probably noticed that I look different from most people you see on stages like this. I have a port wine birthmark that covers half my face, and I've been told by hiring managers that I'm not appropriate for client-facing roles because I don't represent their brand's image of perfection. But here's what that hiring manager didn't understand. Authenticity is the most powerful brand attribute in today's market, and diversity isn't a checkbox to fill. It's a competitive advantage to leverage. The room went silent, and for a moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then someone started clapping, and then another person, and suddenly the entire room was on their feet giving me a standing ovation before I'd even delivered my actual presentation. That moment crystallized something for me. My difference wasn't my weakness. It was my superpower. It gave me perspective that others lacked, empathy that created deeper connections, and a story that resonated with anyone who'd ever felt like they didn't fit the mold. My career trajectory accelerated after that conference. I was headhunted by larger companies, offered positions with impressive titles and even more impressive salaries. But I stayed loyal to Technova and to Patricia, who'd given me a chance when I needed it most. Instead of leaving, I negotiated for equity in the company, believing in our mission and our potential. That faith paid off when, 3 years after I'd joined, Technova was acquired by one of the largest educational technology corporations in the world for a sum that made headlines in the tech industry. Suddenly, at 27 years old, I found myself with the kind of financial security I'd never imagined possible, and the freedom to chart my own course. I could have retired, could have taken a long vacation, could have simply enjoyed the fruits of my labor. But I wasn't done. I wasn't even close to done. Because every time I considered slowing down, I remembered Daniel Morrison's face, his laugh, his casual cruelty, and the promise I'd made to myself that day. So instead of retiring, I did something that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. I started my own marketing consultancy, specializing in brand transformation and inclusive marketing strategies. Building my own company was simultaneously the hardest and most rewarding thing I'd ever done. I called it Kaleidoscope Consulting, a name that reflected my belief that the most beautiful and effective brands were those that embraced multiple perspectives and diverse voices. I started small, working out of a co-working space with just myself and one assistant, but I had something that many new consultancies lacked: a proven track record, industry connections, and the proceeds from the Technova acquisition to fund operations until we became profitable. My first client was a mid-sized cosmetics company, struggling to connect with younger consumers who were increasingly skeptical of traditional beauty standards. I proposed a radical campaign that featured real customers with visible differences: scars, birthmarks, vitiligo, disabilities, celebrating beauty in all its authentic forms rather than the airbrushed perfection that had dominated the industry for decades. The company's board was hesitant, worried about alienating their traditional customer base, but I convinced them to test it in one market before rolling it out nationally. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Sales in the test market increased by 43%, social media engagement went through the roof, and the campaign earned organic media coverage worth millions in advertising value. More importantly, the company received thousands of messages from customers saying they finally felt seen and represented by a beauty brand. That success became my calling card, and suddenly everyone wanted to work with Kaleidoscope Consulting. Within 2 years, we'd grown to a team of 25 consultants. We'd moved into a beautiful office space in the same downtown district where I'd once been humiliated by Daniel Morrison, and we'd worked with some of the biggest brands in the world, helping them evolve their marketing to reflect the diversity of their actual customer base. I made a point of hiring people who'd been overlooked or underestimated by traditional firms. My team included people with visible disabilities, individuals from marginalized communities, professionals who'd been told they weren't polished enough or professional-looking enough for client-facing roles. We weren't just diverse for diversity's sake. We were diverse because those varied perspectives made us better strategists, more creative problem solvers, more effective marketers. Our difference was our competitive advantage, exactly as I'd argued in that conference speech years earlier. I also made it a policy to pay well above industry standards and to offer equity to key team members, remembering what it felt like to struggle financially while working multiple jobs to survive. As Kaleidoscope grew, so did my profile in the industry. I was invited to speak at major marketing conferences around the world. My articles were published in prestigious business journals, and I was named to several 30 under 30 and 40 under 40 lists, celebrating young leaders in marketing and business. I won't lie. The recognition felt good, but it wasn't the recognition itself that mattered to me. What mattered was that I was building something meaningful, creating opportunities for people who'd been dismissed or overlooked, and proving that inclusive marketing wasn't just ethically sound but financially superior. Every award, every speaking engagement, every successful campaign was another brick in the foundation of the empire I was building. And with each brick, I thought about Daniel Morrison and wondered if he ever thought about the woman he'd mocked in that conference room. I doubted it. He'd said he would forget me before leaving the room, and I had no reason to believe that wasn't true. But that didn't matter because I wasn't building this for him. I was building it for me, for everyone who'd ever been judged unfairly, for the young woman I'd been who'd believed her appearance would limit her potential. Still, sometimes late at night when I was alone in my office reviewing quarterly reports or preparing for a pitch, I'd imagine what it would feel like to run into Morrison again, to see the recognition dawn in his eyes when he realized who I'd become. Would he remember his cruelty? Would he feel even a flicker of regret? Or would he rationalize it somehow, convince himself that his behavior had been justified or at least not as bad as I remembered? These were the thoughts that kept me up at night, along with the strategic plans and creative concepts that were the lifeblood of my business. The universe has a funny way of arranging coincidences that feel almost too perfect to be real. 4 years after that devastating interview, I received an email that made my heart stop. It was from Jennifer, the HR representative who'd been in the room during my humiliation at Morrison & Klein, the woman who'd praised my credentials before her boss had mocked my appearance, the woman who'd stayed silent when I needed someone to speak up. Her email was brief and professional, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential consulting project for Morrison & Klein. They were facing a brand crisis, she explained, and had heard about Kaleidoscope's expertise in brand transformation and reputation management. She didn't mention our previous encounter, didn't acknowledge the irony of reaching out to me, and I wondered if she even remembered, or if I'd been just another forgettable candidate in an endless stream of interviews. I stared at that email for a long time, emotions swirling through me like a tornado. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately, to send a curt rejection, to make them feel even a fraction of the dismissal I'd experienced. But another part of me, the strategic part that had built a successful business through careful planning and smart decisions, saw this for what it was, an opportunity. Not for revenge, exactly, but for something more meaningful, for closure, for justice, for the chance to show Daniel Morrison exactly who he'd underestimated. I responded professionally, agreeing to a preliminary meeting to discuss their needs, and we scheduled it for the following week. I spent those intervening days preparing in ways that had nothing to do with business strategy. I thought carefully about what I would wear, ultimately choosing a custom-tailored burgundy suit that radiated confidence and success. I rehearsed what I might say if Morrison was in the meeting, how I would maintain my composure and professionalism regardless of what happened. I reminded myself that I was no longer the desperate 23-year-old looking for validation from a cruel man. I was a successful entrepreneur with a track record of results, and a company that was thriving. But despite all my preparation and self-assurance, my hands were shaking when I walked into the Morrison & Klein building that morning. The lobby looked exactly the same, those marble floors and expensive art pieces, but I was completely different. The last time I'd walked through those doors, I'd been carrying hope and naivety like fragile treasures. This time, I was carrying power and success, like weapons I knew exactly how to wield. Jennifer met me in the lobby, and I watched the recognition flicker across her face when she saw me. To her credit, she didn't try to pretend we'd never met. Instead, she extended her hand and said quietly, "I owe you an apology for what happened during your interview. I should have spoken up, and I've regretted my silence ever since." Her words caught me off guard. I'd expected denial or deflection, not accountability, and it softened something in me that I'd been holding rigid for years. I shook her hand and replied, "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to acknowledge past mistakes." We rode the elevator in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed Morrison's cruelty years ago. This silence felt almost companionable, two professionals heading to a meeting, nothing more. But when the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, that calm evaporated because standing there in the reception area, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered, was Daniel Morrison. He was on his phone, barking orders at someone about client retention numbers and market share, and he didn't look up when we exited the elevator. Jennifer led me toward the same conference room where I'd been humiliated, and as we passed Morrison, I heard him say into his phone, "I don't care what excuses they have. If they can't deliver results, they're gone. We don't have room for mediocrity at Morrison & Klein." The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. This man who'd judged me solely on my appearance was now desperate enough to hire the company I'd built, to seek help from the woman he'd dismissed as unworthy of representing his brand. We entered the conference room, and Jennifer gestured for me to sit at the head of the table, a position of power and authority. She offered me water, asked if I needed anything, and there was a deference in her manner that felt like a small victory in itself. A few moments later, Morrison entered, still absorbed in his phone conversation, and took a seat halfway down the table without even glancing in my direction. Jennifer cleared her throat. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like to introduce you to the founder and CEO of Kaleidoscope Consulting." But I interrupted, wanting to control this moment, to savor it. "We've actually met before, Jennifer. Mr. Morrison interviewed me for a position here about 4 years ago." Morrison finally looked up from his phone, and I watched his eyes travel from my face to his memory banks, searching for any recollection. I could see the moment recognition started to dawn, the way his confident expression faltered slightly, the way his gaze fixed on my birthmark, and then quickly darted away. I'm sorry, I don't recall," he stammered, but we both knew he was lying. I could see it in the way his face had gone slightly pale, in the way he'd suddenly become very interested in the papers in front of him. I let the silence stretch out, watching Morrison squirm in his expensive leather chair, watching him realize that the woman he'd once dismissed with such casual cruelty was now sitting at the head of his conference table, holding the potential solution to his company's problems. Jennifer looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its source, and I almost felt sorry for her being caught in the middle of this moment. Finally, I broke the silence with a voice that was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of the emotion churning inside me. Let me refresh your memory, Mr. Morrison. 4 years ago, I interviewed for a marketing position at your firm. You told me that I looked like I'd gotten into a fight with a paintbrush, and that I should consider a different career path altogether. You said your brand was about excellence, beauty, and perfection, and that someone like me couldn't represent Morrison & Klein to clients. You laughed at me, actually laughed, and told me you'd forget about me before you even left the room. The color drained completely from Morrison's face now, and I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Jennifer's eyes went wide, and she looked at Morrison with an expression that mixed horror and disappointment. To my surprise, Morrison didn't deny it or try to minimize what he'd done. Instead, he seemed to shrink in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years, and then some. That was, he started, but words seemed to fail him. I continued, keeping my tone measured and professional even though my heart was pounding. You were right about one thing, Mr. Morrison. You did forget about me, but I never forgot about you. In fact, I've thought about you quite often over the past 4 years, every time I closed a deal, every time I hired someone who'd been told they weren't polished enough or professional-looking enough, every time I proved that authentic representation creates stronger brands than artificial perfection. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd prepared, clicking through slides that showed Kaleidoscope's client list, our results, our growth trajectory, our awards and industry recognition. Morrison stared at the screen, and I could see him processing the implications, realizing that the woman he'd dismissed as unemployable had built something far more impressive than anything he'd achieved riding on his father's name and reputation. So here's where we are now, I said, leaning back in my chair with a confidence I'd earned through years of hard work and success. You've reached out to Kaleidoscope because Morrison & Klein is facing a brand crisis. From what I've researched before this meeting, your company is hemorrhaging clients. Your market share has dropped by 37% over the past 2 years, and your reputation in the industry is that you're out of touch with modern consumer values and marketing practices. You need help, and you need it desperately. The question is whether I'm willing to provide that help to a company whose hiring manager once told me I wasn't fit to represent their brand. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. What I said to you that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant, cruel, and completely out of line. If I could take it back, I would, but I can't. All I can do is apologize sincerely and hope that you're professional enough to separate personal history from business opportunity. I had to give him credit for that response. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his behavior. He didn't claim it was a misunderstanding or that I was being oversensitive. He owned his cruelty, even if the apology felt motivated more by desperation than genuine remorse. You're right, I replied. You can't take it back. Those words will be with me forever, just like this birthmark on my face. But unlike my birthmark, which I've learned to see as part of what makes me unique and valuable, your words represent a ugliness of character that no amount of expensive suits or inherited wealth can cover up. Morrison flinched at that, and I saw real pain cross his face. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, probably wondering if this meeting was about to explode into something unprofessional and damaging. But I wasn't done yet. However, I continued, I am professional enough to separate personal feelings from business decisions. I've built Kaleidoscope on the principle that everyone deserves a chance to grow, to learn, to become better than they were. So I'm willing to hear about your brand crisis and consider whether my company can help. But I need you to understand something first, Mr. Morrison. If Kaleidoscope takes on Morrison & Klein as a client, it won't be because I've forgiven you or because I need your business. It will be because I believe in the power of transformation, and because the 243 employees at your firm deserve better leadership and better opportunities than they're currently getting. This isn't about you. It never was. It's about them, and about proving that inclusive, authentic marketing can save even companies as outdated as yours. For the next hour, Morrison and Jennifer laid out the full extent of their brand crisis. It was worse than I'd realized from my preliminary research. Not only were they losing clients and market share, but they'd been publicly called out by several former employees for maintaining a toxic workplace culture that valued appearance over ability, connections over competence. There were pending lawsuits, social media campaigns demanding boycotts, and industry whispers that Morrison and Klein was on the verge of collapse. As I listened to them describe the problems, I could see the patterns clearly. The same arrogance and superficiality that Morrison had displayed in my interview had apparently permeated the entire company culture. They'd created a beautiful facade with nothing substantial behind it, and in an age where consumers and clients valued authenticity and purpose over polish and perfection, that facade was crumbling. "Here's what I'm seeing," I said when they'd finished their presentation. "Morrison and Klein doesn't have a brand problem. You have a values problem. You've built your entire identity on an outdated notion of excellence that equates worth with appearance, that values style over substance, that mistakes privilege for merit. No marketing campaign or brand refresh is going to fix that. You need a complete cultural transformation, and that starts from the top." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue but knew he couldn't. "What would that transformation look like?" he asked quietly. I smiled, not unkindly. "It would look like everything you mocked me for 4 years ago becoming your new normal." Over the next 2 hours, I outlined a comprehensive transformation plan for Morrison and Klein that was as radical as it was necessary. I explained how they needed to completely overhaul their hiring practices to focus on skills and potential, rather than appearance and connections, how they needed to implement unconscious bias training for all managers and executives, how they needed to diversify their client portfolio to include companies that aligned with more progressive values, and how they needed to publicly acknowledge their past mistakes and commit to doing better. Morrison listened with an expression that cycled between discomfort, resistance, and something that might have been genuine understanding. When I finished, he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "And if we implement all of this, if we truly transform our culture and our brand, will that be enough to save the company?" I met his eyes directly, making sure he understood the gravity of what I was about to say. "Maybe, maybe not. The market doesn't owe you success, Mr. Morrison, just like your company didn't owe me an interview free from mockery and discrimination. What I can tell you is that if you don't make these changes, your company will absolutely fail. The world has moved on from the values Morrison and Klein represents, and you can either evolve or become extinct. The choice is yours." Jennifer spoke up then, her voice careful but determined. "If we agree to move forward with this transformation plan and hire Kaleidoscope as our consultants, what would be your role personally? Would you be leading the project?" It was a fair question, and I'd been thinking about the answer since I first received Jennifer's email. Part of me wanted to lead the project personally, to be present for every meeting, to watch Morrison confront his biases and outdated beliefs on a daily basis. But another part of me, the part that had built a successful company and learned to make strategic rather than emotional decisions, knew that wasn't the right choice. I would oversee the project and be involved in key strategic decisions and milestone meetings, I replied. But the day-to-day work would be led by my partner, Marcus Chen, who specializes in organizational culture transformation. He's brilliant at this work, and frankly, he doesn't have the personal history with your company that might compromise objectivity. If Morrison and Klein is serious about transformation, you need consultants who will push you and challenge you without any emotional baggage clouding their judgment. Morrison nodded slowly, and I could see relief flicker across his face at the prospect of not having to face me constantly throughout the process. But I wasn't letting him off that easily. "However," I added, "there will be one condition to Kaleidoscope taking on this project. Mr. Morrison, you will need to participate in every training session, every workshop, every difficult conversation about bias and privilege. You don't get to delegate this to HR or to your managers. You are the symbol of what's broken in this company's culture, which means you need to be the symbol of its transformation. And at some point in this process, you will need to publicly acknowledge the role your personal biases have played in creating the toxic culture that now threatens your company's existence." The silence that followed was heavy with significance. Morrison looked like he wanted to refuse, to find some way to maintain his pride and his position without subjecting himself to that level of exposure and accountability. But he also knew he had no choice, that his company's survival depended on accepting these terms. "I agree," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what it takes to save Morrison and Klein, and to right some of the wrongs we've committed, I agree." Jennifer looked visibly relieved, and she started discussing logistics, timelines, and next steps. But I was watching Morrison, studying his face for any sign that his agreement was genuine rather than just pragmatic. What I saw surprised me. Beneath the discomfort and embarrassment, there seemed to be something that looked almost like hope, like maybe part of him wanted to become better than he'd been, wanted to build something more meaningful than the superficial empire his father had created. As the meeting concluded and we discussed contract terms and project scope, I felt something shifting inside me. The anger I'd carried for 4 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it felt different now, less sharp, less consuming. I'd spent so long imagining this confrontation, planning what I would say to make Morrison understand the damage his words had caused, preparing to watch him squirm and suffer. But now that the moment had arrived, I discovered that his suffering didn't bring me the satisfaction I'd expected. What brought me satisfaction was the realization that I'd built something so significant that even the man who'd dismissed me now needed my expertise, that I'd proven my worth so thoroughly that his opinion of me had become completely irrelevant. When we finally stood to shake hands and formalize our agreement to move forward, Morrison held my hand a moment longer than necessary and said, "I know this doesn't undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that I truly am sorry for what I said to you that day. You deserved better, and I failed to give you the respect and dignity that every person deserves. I hope that through this process I can learn to be better." I looked at him. This man who'd haunted my thoughts for years, who'd represented everything wrong with systems that judge worth by appearance and value, privilege over merit. And I saw not a villain, but simply a flawed human being who'd been given too much power too early and had wielded it carelessly. "Mr. Morrison," I replied, "I hope so too. Not for your sake, but for the sake of every person who walks through your doors hoping for a fair chance to prove their worth." The transformation of Morrison and Klein took place over 18 months, and it was one of the most challenging and rewarding projects Kaleidoscope had ever undertaken. Marcus Chen led the team brilliantly, implementing unconscious bias training, restructuring hiring processes, and working with department heads to identify and address systemic issues that had been embedded in the company culture for decades. I stayed involved at the strategic level, reviewing progress reports, attending monthly milestone meetings, and watching from a distance as the company slowly began to change. But the most significant transformation wasn't happening in the policies or procedures. It was happening in Daniel Morrison himself. Jennifer kept me updated on his progress, telling me how he'd initially resisted the training sessions, how he'd struggled to acknowledge his own biases, how difficult it had been for him to recognize the ways his privilege had shaped his worldview. But gradually, something shifted. Morrison began asking questions instead of making assumptions, listening instead of dismissing, learning instead of defending. About 6 months into the project, I received an unexpected email from Morrison himself. In it, he didn't ask for forgiveness or try to justify his past behavior. Instead, he shared something deeply personal. He wrote about his father, the company founder, who'd built Morrison and Klein on the principle that image was everything, who'd taught his son that success meant looking the part and surrounding yourself with people who reflected the right kind of success. Morrison wrote about the pressure of living up to impossible standards, about the fear of disappointing his father, about the way those lessons had warped his understanding of worth and value. He wasn't making excuses. He was clear about that. He was simply trying to trace the roots of his cruelty, to understand how he'd become someone capable of laughing at a young woman's appearance and dismissing her dreams so casually. The email ended with a question. Would I be willing to meet with him privately, not as consultant and client, but as two people trying to understand how systems of privilege and discrimination are perpetuated across generations? I thought about that email for several days before responding. Part of me was suspicious of his motives, wondering if this was some calculated move to earn my sympathy or to manipulate me into being less demanding in our transformation work. But another part of me recognized the vulnerability in his words, the genuine desire to understand and grow that seemed to be emerging from someone who'd spent most of his life never questioning his assumptions or examining his biases. I agreed to meet him at a small coffee shop, neutral territory away from both our offices, on a Saturday morning when we could talk without the pressures of professional roles and responsibilities. When I arrived, Morrison was already there, sitting at a corner table looking nervous and uncertain, nothing like the arrogant man who'd mocked me in that conference room years ago. We talked for nearly 3 hours that morning, and it was one of the most unexpected conversations of my life. Morrison shared stories about his childhood, about a father who'd measured his worth in grades and achievements, about always feeling like he had to prove himself worthy of the family name and legacy. He talked about the first time he'd disappointed his father by bringing home a report card with a B instead of straight A's, and how his father had looked at him with such cold disappointment that Morrison had vowed to never fall short again. I listened, and despite myself, despite all the hurt and anger I'd carried, I felt something that surprised me: compassion. Not for what he'd done to me, but for the scared boy he'd been, for the impossible standards he'd internalized, for the way those wounds had turned him into someone who inflicted similar wounds on others. When it was my turn to share, I told Morrison about growing up with my birthmark, about the stares and whispers, about children who'd crossed to the other side of the street to avoid walking past me, about teenagers who'd asked if I was contagious, about adults who'd talked to me like I was mentally impaired simply because I looked different. I told him about the doctor's appointments and laser treatments my parents had saved for, but couldn't afford, about the makeup tutorials I'd watched trying to cover something that couldn't be hidden, about the years I'd spent believing that my appearance was something to apologize for. What changed? Morrison asked quietly. When did you stop apologizing? I thought about that question, really thought about it, and realized the answer was both simple and profound. When you laughed at me in that conference room, I said. That was rock bottom for me, the moment when I had to choose between accepting the limitations others put on me or deciding to redefine success on my own terms. You meant to destroy me that day, Mr. Morrison, but you accidentally freed me. You showed me that no matter how hard I worked or how qualified I was, there would always be people who judged me solely on my appearance. And once I accepted that reality, I could stop trying to change their minds and start building something for people who valued substance over surface. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. When he finally looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. Actual tears. And I could see genuine anguish in his expression. I've hurt so many people with my prejudices and my arrogance, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just you, though what I did to you was particularly cruel. But Jennifer recently showed me a folder of complaints and exit interview notes from employees who left Morrison and Klein over the years, people who felt undervalued, dismissed, discriminated against because they didn't fit our narrow definition of what success should look like. I read about a talented designer who quit after being told she needed to lose weight to be client-facing. I read about a brilliant strategist who was passed over for promotion because his accent was too thick. I read about a project manager who was told to be more aggressive and less emotional when she was simply being thorough and thoughtful. All of these incredibly talented people left our company or never reached their potential because of a culture I created and perpetuated. I watched him struggle with this realization, with the weight of understanding that his biases had real consequences for real people. Part of me felt vindicated, felt like this was the accountability I'd wanted for so long. But another part of me felt something unexpected. A desire to help him carry that weight, not to make it lighter, but to help him transform it into something meaningful. Mr. Morrison, I said, using his formal name deliberately, because we weren't friends and I didn't want to pretend we were. The question isn't whether you've caused harm. You clearly have. And you're beginning to understand the extent of that harm. The question is what you do with that understanding. Do you use it to beat yourself up and wallow in guilt? Or do you use it to fuel genuine change? Not just in your company, but in yourself? He wiped at his eyes, embarrassed by his tears, but not hiding them. I want to change. I genuinely do. But I don't even know if that's possible at this point. I'm 41 years old. These prejudices have been part of how I see the world for so long. What if I'm too broken to fix? I surprised myself by reaching across the table and putting my hand on his arm. A gesture of connection I never would have imagined making with this man who'd caused me so much pain. You're not broken, I said firmly. You're unfinished. There's a difference. Broken implies you can't be repaired. Unfinished means you have work to do, growth to experience, learning to pursue. The fact that you're asking these questions, that you're feeling this discomfort, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of transformation. Over the weeks and months that followed that conversation, I watched Morrison engage with the transformation process in a way I'd never expected. He didn't just attend the mandatory training sessions. He facilitated discussions, asking hard questions about his own biases, and inviting others to challenge his perspectives. He implemented new hiring practices that focused on blind resume reviews and skills-based assessments rather than pedigree and appearance. He personally apologized to former employees who'd left the company feeling undervalued or discriminated against, not to convince them to come back, but simply to acknowledge the harm he'd caused and take responsibility for it. The most significant change came about a year into our project, when Morrison made a decision that shocked everyone, including me. He stepped down as regional hiring manager and moved into a non-management role as a senior strategist, using his industry knowledge and connections to support the company, but removing himself from positions of power where his biases could continue to cause harm. In his place, Morrison and Klein promoted a woman named Aisha Rahman, a brilliant marketer who'd been with the company for 8 years, but had been consistently overlooked for leadership positions because, as she later told me, She wore a hijab and spoke with an accent and didn't fit the Morrison and Klein image. Under Aisha's leadership, combined with the cultural transformation work Kaleidoscope had implemented, Morrison and Klein began to turn around. Client retention improved, new business started coming in, and the company's reputation slowly shifted from outdated and discriminatory to forward-thinking and inclusive. Industry publications wrote about their transformation as a case study in how companies can evolve and survive by embracing rather than resisting change. But perhaps the most meaningful change was invisible to outsiders and impossible to quantify in quarterly reports. It was the shift in energy when you walked through the office, the diversity of faces and voices and perspectives, the sense that people felt safe to bring their authentic selves to work, the knowledge that merit mattered more than appearance, that substance trumped surface. Jennifer told me during one of our check-in calls that the transformation had been harder and more painful than anyone expected, but that it had been worth it. "We're not perfect," she said honestly. "We still have work to do, biases to confront, systems to change, but we're moving in the right direction, and that's something we couldn't say a year and a half ago." As the official consulting project drew to a close, Kaleidoscope prepared a final presentation for Morrison and Klein's board of directors, showcasing the progress they'd made, the metrics that had improved, and the recommendations for sustaining the transformation long-term. Morrison asked if I would deliver the presentation personally rather than having Marcus do it, and after some consideration, I agreed. On the day of the final presentation, I walked into Morrison and Klein's boardroom wearing the same burgundy suit I'd worn to our first meeting, but I felt completely different than I had that day. I wasn't nervous or angry or looking for revenge. I was simply a professional doing excellent work, sharing results with a client, closing out a successful project. The board members listened attentively as I walked them through the data. Employee satisfaction scores up by 62%, client retention up by 45%, new business development exceeding targets by 38%. Positive media mentions outpacing negative ones for the first time in 3 years. But beyond the metrics, I shared stories, testimonials from employees about how the culture had changed, feedback from clients about why they chose to work with Morrison and Klein again, or for the first time, examples of innovative campaigns and solutions that had emerged from the newly diverse and empowered team. When I finished, the board chair, Morrison's father and company founder, stood to address the room. I'd been warned that he was resistant to the changes, skeptical of the whole transformation process, and I braced myself for criticism or dismissal. But what came out of his mouth surprised everyone. "I built this company on certain principles," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the industry. "I believe that image was everything, that success had a certain look, a certain pedigree, a certain polish. I taught my son those same principles, and I see now that I did him and this company a great disservice. What I'm learning, probably too late in my life but better late than never, is that real excellence comes from substance, from talent, from perspective, from the courage to challenge the status quo. This young woman," he gestured toward me, "represents everything I thought was wrong for our brand, and she has proven to be exactly what our company needed to survive." He turned to look directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of Morrison's tears in the coffee shop. Genuine remorse, authentic recognition of harm caused, real desire to do better. "Ms. Kaleidoscope," he said, using my company name as a surname since he didn't actually know my personal name. "On behalf of Morrison and Klein, and on behalf of my son who I know has already expressed this privately, I apologize for the treatment you received from our company and from our family. You deserved better, and I hope that the changes we've made, while they can't undo the past, can at least prevent future talented individuals from experiencing what you went through." The room was silent except for the older man's voice, and I felt tears prickling at my own eyes now, not from sadness but from something more complex, a mixture of vindication, relief, closure, and the bittersweet recognition that transformation is possible, but it requires courage, humility, and relentless effort. "Thank you, sir," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "I accept your apology, and I'm grateful for the work Morrison and Klein has done to become a company that truly values excellence in all its authentic forms." After the meeting concluded, Morrison walked me to the elevator, and we stood there in the reception area where I'd first seen him 4 years ago, the place where this whole story had really begun. "I'll never forget your face," he said quietly, echoing my own words from that awful day but giving them a completely different meaning. "Not because of your birthmark, though that's certainly memorable, but because you represent something I needed to learn. That true worth can't be judged by appearance, That real excellence often comes in packages we don't expect. That transformation is possible if we're brave enough to confront our own biases and humble enough to admit when we've been wrong. I smiled, genuinely this time, not with the calculated professionalism I'd maintained throughout our project, but with real warmth. Good, I said. Remember my face as a reminder that the people you underestimate might just be the ones who end up saving you. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. But before they closed, Morrison called out one more thing. What you've built with Kaleidoscope, what you've accomplished in your career, what you've done with your life, it's remarkable. Not despite your appearance, but because of everything that comes with being someone who's had to fight for recognition and respect. You've turned your difference into your superpower, and I hope you know how extraordinary that is. As the elevator descended, I reflected on his words and on the entire journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years ago, I'd stood in this same elevator, broken and humiliated, crying in a park bench, wondering if I'd ever prove my worth to a world that seemed determined to judge me by my appearance. Now I was leaving as the founder of a successful consulting firm, as someone who'd literally transformed the company that had rejected her, as a person who'd proven that excellence comes in all forms, and that authentic representation creates stronger brands and better businesses than artificial perfection ever could. But my story doesn't end with that triumphant elevator ride or with Morrison's recognition of what I'd accomplished. The real ending, the one that matters most, is about what happened inside me during those 4 years of building and striving and proving myself. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being motivated by Morrison's cruelty and started being motivated by something deeper and more sustainable. A genuine passion for helping people and companies become their authentic best selves. A real commitment to creating opportunities for those who'd been overlooked. A true belief in the power of inclusive marketing and diverse perspectives. The anger that had fueled me initially had transformed into purpose, and that purpose had become the foundation of everything I built. I realized that the best revenge wasn't making Morrison suffer or feel guilty. It was becoming so successful and fulfilled that his opinion of me became completely irrelevant. The ultimate victory wasn't hearing his apology. It was no longer needing his apology to feel whole and valuable. About 6 months after our project concluded, I received a message from Morrison through LinkedIn. He'd seen that Kaleidoscope had been named Marketing Consultancy of the Year by a major industry publication, and he'd written to congratulate me. But what struck me most about his message wasn't the congratulations. It was what he shared about his own journey. He wrote about how he'd been volunteering as a mentor for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, trying to use his connections and industry knowledge to open doors that had been closed to people who didn't fit traditional molds of success. He wrote about how he'd started speaking publicly about his own transformation, not to position himself as some kind of hero, but to encourage other leaders to examine their biases, before those biases caused the kind of harm his had caused. He wrote about how his relationship with his father had changed, how they'd had difficult conversations about legacy and values and what truly mattered. And he ended by saying something that brought tears to my eyes. You changed my life in ways you'll never fully understand. Not by saving my company, though you did that too, but by showing me that I could become better than I'd been. That transformation is possible at any age, that it's never too late to confront your biases and choose to be more human, more compassionate, more just. Thank you for giving me that gift, even though I didn't deserve it. I never responded to that message because I didn't know what to say. And honestly, I didn't feel like I owed him a response. But I saved it. And sometimes when I'm having a difficult day or questioning whether the work I do truly matters, I read it and remember that change is possible, that people can grow, that even the cruelest acts can become catalysts for transformation if we choose to use them that way. Today, Kaleidoscope Consulting has offices in 5 cities, a team of over 100 consultants, and a client list that includes some of the most innovative and forward-thinking companies in the world. We've helped dozens of organizations transform their cultures, embrace authentic diversity, and build brands that truly reflect the varied beauty of human experience. I've spoken at conferences on 6 continents, written a book about inclusive marketing that became required reading in several business schools, and been recognized as one of the most influential voices in my industry. But none of those accomplishments mean as much to me as the messages I receive from people who tell me that seeing someone like me succeed gave them courage to pursue their own dreams, that knowing I'd turned my difference into my strength helped them embrace their own uniqueness, that my story reminded them that other people's limitations don't have to become their reality. Have you ever experienced something that completely changed the trajectory of your life? A moment of cruelty or rejection that could have destroyed you, but instead became the fuel for your transformation? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share your experiences of overcoming judgment, of proving wrong those who underestimated you, of turning your perceived weaknesses into your greatest strengths. Your story matters, and you never know who might need to hear it today. Understanding this journey, from humiliation to triumph, from anger to purpose, from seeking revenge to choosing transformation, is crucial because it reminds us that we always have a choice in how we respond to cruelty and injustice. We can let it define us and limit us, or we can use it as motivation to become more than anyone expected, to build something meaningful, to create change that extends far beyond our personal vindication. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own resilience and potential, please leave a like on this video. Your support helps stories like mine reach people who need to hear them, who need to know that their difference isn't a defect but a feature, that their struggles can become their strengths, that transformation is always possible. And if you want to hear more stories about overcoming adversity, about turning pain into purpose, about the incredible things that happen when we refuse to accept other people's limitations, please subscribe to Through My Eyes and hit that notification bell. This channel is dedicated to sharing authentic stories of transformation, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit to rise above circumstances and create meaning from suffering. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for taking the time to understand that behind every face, every appearance, every surface difference, there's a human being with dreams and talents and worth that can't be measured by superficial standards. Remember, you are more than what others see when they look at you. You are what you build, what you create, what you contribute to the world. Don't let anyone else's limited vision become your reality. Keep pushing, keep growing, keep proving that excellence comes in all forms, and that the people who get dismissed and underestimated are often the ones who end up changing the world.